guess we can get started. I'm going to be walking through how to create a new node policy for Bitcoin nuts. First step is going to be obviously to clone the repository. And that's just on GitHub, Bitcoin nuts / Bitcoin. So the first step to creating a new policy is to figure out what you want to filter, or prioritize for that matter. For today, we're going to start with Citria's Watchtower challenges. So we've got the easiest way is usually to look at an on-chain transaction, but since this one's not a very common one, usually it's only in a abnormal circumstance anyway. You have to look at the code, and you can see how the transactions are constructed. So you can see these, it's usually 3 outputs, 2 fake pay to taproot, and then an op return that's 80 bytes. So that's going to be the basis. So the most important, well, maybe not the most important, but first step is to add an actual option. Some people may not want to use the filter, some people may. By default, it should be off in the code. So down in the policy.h is where the defaults usually get defined. We define a default, just set to default false. And then in mempool args.c++ under the node directory is where you actually load the value that's been set in the config file. This is fairly straightforward. You have to add the option to mempool options.h as well to actually set it to, and then in init.c++ you document it. And if you don't document it, you'll have the problem that the checks will reject the option entirely, so it does need to be documented, or at least added to the argman. Once you do that, you can get right into actually making the policy. This is fairly simple as well, actually simpler than adding the argument. That can be in validation.c++ sometimes, but usually it's in a policy file. In this case, policy.c++ is where the standard transaction function is. There's multiple in standard functions, but the one we have to look at it at the transaction level because it's matching based on multiple outputs. Depending on what you're filtering, you could have it just be based in the output format itself or the input format. But here we are, to keep it simple, we're just counting the number of pay to taproot outputs. So as we go through the outputs, we check if there's witness v1 taproot, we just increment the number. And then down here, we can simply look for the 1 data output, the total number of outputs being 3, the number of pay to taproot outputs being 2, and that adds up to cover all 3. And then make sure the option's actually on and potentially reject it. And the maybe reject is actually a macro in Knots that checks that it's not been overridden by the user. When they send a raw transaction, they can specify which options to override. So that's it, how simple adding the actual code for the policy itself is. And then you no longer have to deal with that. Then after that, it's pretty much just boilerplate stuff that you add to the GUI. In the options dialog, you need to add in this case it's Boolean, so we just do a checkbox. Can add a description so the user actually knows what it does. So I have to open the file here. Oops. File. And you can do some of this in core. The GUI part's definitely going to need knots because only knots has it in the GUI. So the set enabled there is because it's part of being in the standard transaction function means that it only runs if non-standard transactions are being rejected. So we have to have it so that when the non-standard transaction option is enabled or disabled, the checkbox itself is accessible. So if someone enables non-standard transaction acceptance, the checkbox for filtering Citria and a bunch of other stuff is disabled simply because it will no longer be effective. The list of strings here, which file is that in? That's an options model. Oops. So this list of strings here is mainly so that if the command line option is provided for reject Citria, it informs the GUI user that the configuration file option is being overridden on the command line. And then we've got a getter and a setter for the option, and as well as an options model, there's in the header, there's a enum with the various options that is used for within the GUI deciding what to pass around. After the GUI is done, it's usually best to have at least a test or two. For the test, just modify an existing standard transaction test. We first create the transaction that we want it to match. In this case, we're manually creating the pay to taproot outputs and also a op return output of the correct size, which you'll have noticed in the filter, we don't actually check the size. You can be as specific or inspecific as you need to be. In this case, there aren't likely to be any false positives. Need to make sure the other policies don't impact your test. The default max data carrier bytes and knots is 42 bytes, but since this is using an 80 byte op return, we have to increase that to 83 for the tests. First, we also initialize the policy option to off. We make sure that with the policy off, it still says it's standard. And then we turn it on, check that it rejects it. And then we change it so that it no longer matches the policy and check that even with the policy on, it doesn't match other stuff. And that's important because you don't want it to accidentally filter more than it's supposed to. Then we turn it back off, set things back up how they were before the test so that it doesn't impact other tests. And when all is said and done, you can start the node. You've got the new policy option right there in the settings. Right there. So you can turn it on or off. If you would want it to be on by default, you go back into the policy.h file. You change the default here, but also there's a feature in Bitcoin Knots where is my files? Okay. Sorry, I'm not used to this computer. There's a feature in Bitcoin Knots called core policy, so that if this feature is enabled, you want the defaults to remain the same as Bitcoin Core. So if you change the default anywhere else, you need to add it here. Actually, false is not going to work because it needs a string. And that way, if core policy is set, it sets it back up to the Bitcoin core defaults. Any questions?